Good afternoon. My name is Melinda Haring, and I'm the Deputy Director of the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. Thank you for coming back for day 2. Yesterday, we were so privileged to host Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, the leader of the Belarusian opposition, for a conversation. If you haven't had a chance to listen to that short discussion, I encourage you to have a look on our website. Today, though, we have 4 phenomenal experts here to talk about, is the tide turning in Belarus? It's my privilege to introduce Franak Viačorka, who is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and also an advisor to Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya. Welcome, Franak. Great to have you with us. Dr. Michael Carpenter, who is the managing director of the Penn Biden Center and also a non-resident at the Atlantic Council. Mike, thanks for being here.
Thanks, Melinda.
Absolutely. Next up is Ambassador John Herbst, the director of the Eurasia Center. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Melinda.
And finally, last but not least, is Dr. Anders Oslin, the great expert on economies in the former Soviet Union and our colleague at the Atlantic Council. Welcome, Anders. So before we jump in, I'm going to ask my colleague to put 2 little notes in the chat box. One is a conversation that has basically short bullets on what Tikhanovskaya said yesterday, and then also an op-ed that Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya wrote in the Washington Post, and he's going to post those links. If you haven't had a chance to look at them, have a look at them. Okay, let's dive into our conversation. Franak, I'd like you to bring us up to speed and remind us why this struggle matters. I think we've all, the protests have been going on for months now. Why are people on the streets, and why haven't the protests really diminished?
The protests didn't diminish because of the people will, inspiration, energy. We are basically observing how the Belarus nation is being born or being reborn. We see many initiatives that emerged quite recently since August. These initiatives work with families of repressed. They work with COVID. They help women. There are several initiatives supporting seniors, and they organize rallies every week. And this authentic, organic, grassroots civil society is very mobilized. People are not afraid of repressions and terror organized by Lukashenka's law enforcement agencies. And there is a very strong feeling and desire of changes. Lukashenko is really hated, both by those who were always in the opposition and by new opposition that emerged quite recently. And I'm totally agree with Tsikhanouskaya that there is no way back. We are at the stage when the moment of no way back has been passed. But what we have to do, we have to foster these changes, and we have to avoid more victims in this desire and this fight for new elections.
Wonderful. Thanks, Franak. That's really encouraging. When we read the news about Belarus here in the United States, the word that we hear over and over again is stalemate. It's in almost every article. So we know that the people are going out every weekend, and there's thousands of people. But we also know that there haven't been that many defections in the police force. There's only been several hundred. You disagree and think the situation isn't at a stalemate, and that the momentum is behind the democratic forces. Why is that?
Oh, definitely there is no stalemate. There is some dynamic which is happening within the elite. We don't see the street protest. There is stalemate in the street protest because all the forms of the street protest were used already. We saw huge marches in the downtown. We saw these neighborhood protests in the sleeping residential areas. But within the elites, inside of the government, there are processes, not just defectors, but also I receive calls from businessmen. I receive messages, from people from the army. We also get some information and some new names who are ready to join or to flee the country and support us. And they say that people are discussing how to help, but there is no solution. Lukashenko built the system when and where the defection will mean the end of career and perhaps the end of freedom for themselves. And we, unfortunately, people who organize this protest movement, we don't have the solution for these people, and we don't have the way to guarantee security. And this is why this protest is slowing down. I mean, this protest of the system destruction.
But the people themselves are not slowing down. You're seeing consistent numbers. You're seeing what other kinds of tactics are you seeing on the streets on the weekends?
It's very cold. It's very windy, cold. In Belarus, winter is horrible. I think that's the worst winter in the world. And I really hate, even without revolution, I really hate, being in December in Minsk because it's very gray, and especially with all this, Soviet architecture, it looks so awful. And even those thousands that are protesting every day and every week, they are real heroes because they protest despite all this desperation and depression caused by Belarus winter. But we are trying to mobilize people for new forms of protest. We basically used all the ways of this nonviolent resistance. We invented many new forms, but we are trying to embrace economic resistance as well. And people are quite engaged, for example, in paying cash, not using banking cards. This allows to not pay taxes for the small entrepreneurs and businessmen. There is also the special system on Telegram and bots where people make some trade operations, avoiding official, legal procurement and procedures. So people also take their money from state banks, from Belarus Bank, Belagroprom Bank. For many people, especially younger people, this is like a game. Many people are registering their businesses in Latvia, Lithuania, who kindly offered opportunity for small businesses to have registration with a simplified procedure in their countries. And they're trying to have lesser operations in Belarus and to pay less taxes in Belarus. And this kind of resistance, this economic resistance, it can help us to continue people involved, but also continuing pressurizing, putting pressure on Lukashenko's regime during the winter time. At any moment when it will get warmer, we will see 100,000 people marches on the streets again.
Franak, I noticed that Telegram was shut down on Sunday. Is that a big deal? The regime shut it down and then it allows it to come back. Telegram is the platform that a lot of the organizing is being done on, right?
Uh, Gosh, it was shocking, and I must say that we got used to Telegram so much, and all the media, all the communications we are keeping right now is on Telegram. And when they shut down Telegram, I don't know how they did this, but they managed somehow to avoid this genius system built by Durov. It was really scary because people lost communication with their families, their friends. We didn't know what's happening on the ground. We didn't know what's happening in the neighborhoods and what's happening in the protest. People didn't send videos or taking pictures. We became so dependent on one messaging applications. And unfortunately, authorities are also learning. And they learned somehow to block Telegram specifically. Before, they were blocking mobile internet on Sundays. So people were not able to communicate when they are protesting already. But now they block specific app, which is crucial, which is critical for the whole infrastructure of the revolution. But I hope Telegram and Durov and all those who are working on security, they will find a way to circumvent.
So sorry, this is a dumb tech question, but is the decision based at Telegram? Can Telegram flip the switch if they know that this is a problem?
In August 9, 10, and 11, after elections, we only two applications were working, Telegram and TikTok. And basically all the news, all the operations, all the communication were on these two applications because all others, including the websites, news websites, were blocked. And finally, during these 3 months, Telegram, because of this dynamic VPN, the technology which allows to have access to the content despite all the blockade, authorities manage somehow to limit access. But Belarus, thanks to the shutdown of the internet in August, many Belarusians have installed special anonymizers, special siphon applications, the Canadian technology to circumvent. And when they block Telegram, I think last Sunday, there was some panic for 1 or 2 hours, but then people reminded themselves, okay, but I have Siphon or I have VPN installed, and they managed to access Telegram finally.
That's good to hear. Let me bring Mike into this conversation. Mike, you're a long observer of Belarus. How do you assess the situation on the ground now? Is stalemate the right word for it? But what's the right term for it that you would use?
No, I don't think it is. I think Franak is right. I don't think there is a stalemate. A couple of things are clear, though. One is that Lukashenko has lost his legitimacy for good. There's no going back to him as legitimate ruler of Belarus. His time is over. You know, when he steps down is a matter of debate, but he's lost his legitimacy. Point number two is that this sort of remarkable national and civic awakening that Franak has described is here to stay. The genie is out of the bottle. There's no putting it back in. So as I've described it before, as others have described it, you know, this is a sort of a twin revolution. It's a revolution of national solidarity where the nation of Belarus coheres as a people. And it's also a revolution of civic awakening where individuals recognize their rights as citizens as opposed to subjects of an authoritarian regime. So that's not changing. The question is, how long does the current power structure stay in place? And that's a question that, frankly, I don't think anybody can predict for you with any great accuracy. You know, if you look back at other examples of civic national awakenings, like the Polish Solidarity Movement, to take just one example, you know, it flowered in 1980, and it was huge. You know, it was enormous. It engulfed all of Poland, and eventually brought down communism, not just in Poland, but really that was sort of the thread that unspooled communism across the Warsaw Pact. But it took, you know, 9 years between the birth of Solidarity and when the Roundtable Agreement in 1989 was finally reached. So we don't know how long this period of standoff will last. For now, it looks like almost all segments of society are either actively or passively rebelling against Lukashenko, except for the Siloviki. So he still has the Siloviki in his hands, and you know he's courting them with this language of an imminent NATO invasion and anti-Western conspiracies, all this sort of stuff. And so he's got them, but he's got no one else. And so how long can he hang on to a police state? You know, that's a good question, but I don't know the answer to that one.
Wonderful. Thanks for those great points, Mike. Franak, I have a question from Shelby Magid. She wants to know, can you tell us more? You spoke a little bit about the civil society initiatives that have been blooming in Belarus, and they're pretty exciting. Tell us about the civil society initiatives that are ongoing to document torture. What can be done to bring justice to Belarus now? We know that torture is a problem, especially among the police force, as Mike just described.
Yeah, unfortunately, torture became the common thing right now, and many people are kept in solitary confinement, which is also the way of torture. When you are detained by police, they also put color marks on your clothing, and these color marks, yellow or red or white, it also will mean how you will be treated in prison or at the police station. You know, they take so much people every day. Sometimes they arrest 1,000 people a day. There were days when we have 2,500 people detained. So police didn't remember what this person has really done. And they put the color marks. And this color marks, it's not only about the torture, it's about dignity, you know, and also people mark with this color. Sometimes they put marks on the hair, on the face. This will lead to very tough attitude of these officers who will meet you in the jail. The major tortures or something that can be treated as torture is happening in the jails. And there is no control there. There are no cameras. We also know from the defected investigator that all the recordings from August were destroyed. So right now, human rights defenders, they are collecting evidences, vocal evidences from witnesses of torture or victims of tortures. We know that some organizations, Danish organization Dignity works on this, International Institutes for Human Rights. There is one case in Lithuania submitted to Lithuania court on torture against Maxim Haroshin. universal jurisdiction was used to submit this case. Similar cases will be submitted in Poland and France. You know that it's possible to submit the case to court in the foreign country using universal jurisdiction. And this is a very good solution for Belarusians because unfortunately we cannot get justice in Belarus. We also ask, demand for international body to investigate torture in Belarus. We wanted the coalition of countries, we asked particularly Canada, Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway, to initiate the international investigation, which can collect and present data for future court or tribunal on Belarus. Belarus is not a part of International Criminal Court or, of course, European Court of Justice, but the collection of evidence is crucially important right now because it will help to restore justice in the future. And also this designation of Gubopi Komon that Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya mentioned yesterday, I know for many people it sounds unrealistic, but this is also the way to restore justice. People wear balaclava and they think that hiding their names and their faces will allow them to avoid punishment. But designating all the participants of this organization as terror groups or guilty in crimes, it will allow, again, to restore a justice which is demanded and expected by people in Belarus.
Great. I hope that you guys will write an article for us in English about that and we can help get the word out, Franak. I think that's a really important initiative. Okay, if you're just joining us, we're talking about what's happening in Minsk, Belarus. We would love to have your questions. You can submit them on Twitter, or if you're in Zoom, go ahead and put them down in the Q&A. Alyaksandr Lukashenka wants to know about Moscow, and that's exactly where I was going. Mike, these two questions are for you and John. So let me ask Mike first. Let's move to Moscow. Some analysts have been arguing that Putin is getting impatient with Lukashenka. Do you agree with that sentiment? Is there evidence to support that claim?
I do. I think he is getting impatient. I think he's waiting for Lukashenka to implement the agreements from Sochi in the fall, and Lukashenka is dragging his feet. So I think Putin, who's a very savvy analyst of the situation in Belarus, knows what I said earlier. He knows that Lukashenka has lost all legitimacy. And so, his preference is to keep him on for a short period of time to allow for the engineering of a transition to another leader that the Kremlin feels will be obedient and serve its interests. That leader in the Kremlin's eyes is certainly not Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, who is independent of the Kremlin's control. And so that's why you have seen the Kremlin speak of the need for constitutional reform, and as well to speak of the need for empowering the Belarusian parliament, where pro-Kremlin parties can serve as surrogates for Russia's interests. So, I think Putin's patience with Lukashenka is wearing thin, but he will back him if necessary in order to prevent a so-called color revolution from occurring on the streets. That is sort of a red line for the Kremlin. I don't think they'll tolerate it. But in the meantime, they're going to do everything behind the scenes that they can to try to orchestrate a transition from Lukashenka to a more pro-Kremlin leader.
Great. John, let me ask you a more specific question from Ambassador Vershba. He said, during his recent visit to Minsk, Foreign Minister Lavrov indicated that Moscow thinks it has a deal with Lukashenka to reform the constitution as the basis for creation of a new government without Lukashenka following new elections. Will Lukashenka live up to this agreement and retire? How can the opposition benefit from this? Or is this a trap to put a Moscow-backed alternative into power? If Ambassador Herbst could go first, and then Franak, I want to let you have a swing at it then too. And Mike, if you want. Go ahead, Ambassador Herbst.
Look, this is clearly something Lukashenko has kind of agreed to. He's talked about leaving after a new constitution's in place. But you can be sure he's maneuvering to prevent that from happening. Ultimately, though, he cannot prevent it. If Moscow insists, he will have no choice because he has no base of support in Belarus from which he can withstand pressure from the Kremlin. Having said that, Moscow's position is not an easy one. Polls are showing that now a minority of Belarusians have a favorable view of Moscow, of Russia. And that's because they've seen Kremlin support for Lukashenko as he's been cracking down. And it's by no means assured that Moscow could put into place a successor who will have legitimacy among the people of Belarus. The point that Michael made at the beginning regarding the growth of civil society and a new attitude in Belarus is critical. History is working against Kremlin authoritarianism and its imposition in Belarus. And Moscow does not have much of an option here. So it will play out this string. But it's interesting. One thing that hasn't come up is we know that representatives of the real opposition, Ms. Tsikhanouskaya, have talked to Kremlin-friendly think tankers. While nothing has come of this, it demonstrates that Moscow knows that it cannot simply ignore the force with real legitimacy in Belarus. So I think we're seeing Moscow facing troubles across the post-Soviet space. In Moldova, as the recent election there of Maya Sandu indicated, in Belarus, and also within Russia itself, as seen in Khabarovsk.
Wonderful, thanks. Michael or Franak, any more comments?
I can just agree with Ambassador. I also think Moscow was not prepared for this scenario and for this development. So they didn't prepare enough infrastructure, enough political powers, political parties in Belarus. Yes, they were playing the long game. They were developing Cossacks organization, cultural initiatives. They were building media, but they were not prepared for 2020. And these events right now, they needed a full revision of the strategy towards Belarus. They didn't expect, to look quickly for someone else except Lukashenko. They were not happy with Lukashenko, but they were okay because there were major problems in other parts of the post-Soviet space. And right now we see that they're trying to find the new personalities. They're trying to invest or create pro-Russian parties in Belarus. They're looking for the opportunity to invest in Belarus media or to buy Belarusian media, including Telegram channels. Telegram became the major space for information control and information competition. And unfortunately, Ambassador is right that Moscow is not ready to talk to us, to talk to Coordination Council or to Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, because they don't know what it will mean and will it help to them. They will be talking only when they have their own scenario and only when they will be sure that the development of the situation will go according to their own scenario. We hear often the date right now, January 20. So we hear now the date January 20 as the deadline for Lukashenko, when Lukashenko must conduct either constitutional reform or change or step down or change something in the structure of the government. Moscow repeats all the time the need of constitutional reform, and Lukashenko today mentioned the need of all Belarus gathering as constitutional body. Lukashenko basically wants to transform Russian idea of this power division and propose something like North Korean model, or when the all people's gathering name the president, avoiding the referendums and the elections. So this is something we heard today from Lukashenko, but I don't think anything of this will happen. I don't think constitutional reform will happen because people are understood already that this is the manipulation, and all people's gathering will look more likely a communist party, communist съезд, коммунистический съезд, communist congresses, and it will not give Lukashenko legitimacy at all. He expects to regain control over agenda through these fake bodies, but I don't think it will be the case.
Thanks, Franak. Mike, any comments?
I would just say, going forward, I think it's going to be important to watch the conversation. Well, it's going to be hard to see or hear, but to look at the relationship that Moscow tries to strike with some of the other presidential candidates, Viktor Babariko and Tsepkalo, the former diplomat. That will potentially offer Moscow an off-ramp from Lukashenko to someone else, but whether those two individuals are willing to accept Moscow's terms, I just simply don't know.
Great, thanks. Now I want to switch our discussion to, you said January 20th. We, of course, know that the U.S. administration is going to change on January 20th. I want to ask this question to Ambassador Herbst and to Dr. Anders Oslin. So, gentlemen, let's see. The U.S. will likely be a much stronger actor in Belarus after President Biden or after President-elect Biden takes office. How do you expect Biden's leadership to change the Belarus calculus in Minsk and Moscow? I'm going to let Anders go first since he hasn't had a chance, and then over to Ambassador Herbst, please.
Yeah, thank you, Melinda. I think that we will see a substantial change. So, for example, presidential candidate Biden spoke up in favor of Belarus with a strong statement during the presidential campaign, while President Trump has not said a word about Belarus as far as I'm aware. So at least in no way condemned what is happening. The US has been lagging far behind the European Union, which has not been very active with regard to sanctions. The elections took place on the 9th of August, and only on the 2nd of October, the US added to the sanctions that the US has maintained since 2006, and then only 8 extra people to the 16 people that were sanctioned from 2006, and nothing more after that. So the US under President Trump has really been a backseat driver or fully asleep in this situation. Thank you. Over to you, John.
I would say there are 2 reasons why we will see a more active and stronger policy from the Biden administration. First of all, of course, Biden understands completely the problem of Kremlin revisionism, something that Trump had trouble getting his mind around, to put it mildly. Secondly, too, Trump put on the back burner, you might say, democratization and human rights issues. For Biden, I think this will be a strong priority. And these 2 motives will give the new administration reason to play a much more active role and a stronger and more consistent role in Belarus than we've seen under President Trump.
Wonderful.
Melinda,
Franak,
if I could just on this, I fully agree with what Anders and John have both said. I think one additional point to make here is, my sense is that a future Biden administration as of January 20th will also work much more closely with our allies and partners. Mm-hmm. And so the coordination piece is actually critical, because it's not just that the US and the EU would be speaking with one voice. It's that unified voice and unified set of policy tools to include sanctions, but not just sanctions. It's also support for independent media, it's support for civil society in Belarus. All of that will be coordinated and harmonized, and will sort of be a force multiplier. So that's something that hasn't happened so far. The US has levied a couple of marginal sanctions on a few top officials in Belarus, but otherwise it is not coordinated and consulted with the EU. And so there's a need to do more, and there's a need to do more in tandem.
Absolutely. And hopefully the US will take the leadership and unify the EU, the UK, and get the Western world marching. We have high hopes for the next administration on Belarus. Franak, a question for you. I know Tsikhanouskaya answered this question yesterday, but I think it's important to repeat it again. Should the US send an ambassador to Minsk now? What's your advice on that?
Definitely, ambassador must be nominated and confirmed. This is very important to have such representation, because charge, it's good, but it's not enough. We need someone who will be focusing on Belarus. But it's very important to avoid the collision, the situation when ambassador will legitimize Lukashenka. Presenting credentials to Lukashenka will partly mean, de facto mean, that Lukashenka is legitimate leader. And when Israeli ambassador presented credentials, that was met very negatively in Belarus, very negatively. And that was perhaps the first ambassador from democratic country who did this, and it was huge disappointment to Belarus people. So when ambassador will be nominated, but there will be a solution found to not give present credentials to Lukashenko, but still to perform duty, perhaps in a limited way, that would be the best solution.
Thanks a lot. That's really clear. John, tell us more. There's an act in Congress right now that seems to have some momentum. It's called the Belarus Democracy, Human Rights and Sovereignty Act of 2020. And Tsikhanouskaya and Franak support it. What's in the bill and how would it help?
What's in the bill would be real sanctions on Belarus, and it would enable us to pursue a more active policy. It has been included in the National Defense Authorization Act, which means it's highly likely to be passed. And this is something which I know that Ms. Tsikhanouskaya really wants to see, and it will demonstrate the type of support for the opposition in Belarus we have not seen to date. And I think it will work nicely with the incoming Biden administration, setting the ground for them to do what I think they will do.
Thank you. Franak, if Congress does pass this act, what do you expect to happen in the EU? Will it have any impact?
When or if Congress passes this act, US will become a champion in Belarus issue, and it will be also the model for European Union, because as it was mentioned before, European Union was always like leading in the Belarus issue, commenting more often, participate in helping civil society. But passing this act will give leadership to the United States, and we will be asking European Union to follow US example, to be, as Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya always says, to be braver on Belarus, to be more active, because Belarusians don't want violence. We want this protest peaceful. But when we remain peaceful, we also expect, more active support of the civilized world, because unfortunately it's very difficult to prevail over heavily armed people, Siloviki, serving to the dictator. And our peaceful protest in combination with the proactive measures, both assistance and sanctions from the Western countries, will give us results, will give us effect. And I have a big hope on this act, because it's not only about sanctions and assistance, it also says about sovereignty and independence, which also means that no third countries to be allowed to misuse Belarusian temporarily weakness caused by political crisis. And it also speaks about providing technology and solutions to circumvent and to give access to information, and also support for media, which are critical in our situation.
Yeah, if I understand right, it also has the ability to allow Voice of America and RVRL to really scale up its operations in Belarus, which would be a really good thing. Anders, I want to dig into sanctions a little bit more, and then we have a number of questions from our audience. Thank you so much for your patience. Anders, could you please give us a little bit of advice? So you've mentioned the sanctions that are in place now. You're not very impressed with them. If you were Mr. Sanctions in the next Biden administration, what would you do to get Lukashenko's attention?
Yeah, first of all, what has been done so far is really quite sad. There are three countries that have taken the lead, the three Baltic countries, and they couldn't get the European Union with them early on. So they undertook sanctions on their own. And it's actually quite effective, because Belarusians of some standing tend to have a summer house in Jurmala, in Latvia, or in Palanga in Lithuania. So therefore it matters, these personal sanctions. And the Baltic countries have now in the second round sanctioned altogether 140 people. The European Union couldn't get its act together for a very silly reason, that Cyprus, which had nothing against these sanctions, also wanted sanctions against Turkey for other reasons. And eventually, after more than a month, Cyprus gave up. And then the US came much later. The European Union sanctions 47 Belarusians, and the US 24 Belarusians. Britain and Canada were supposed to coordinate with the US, but they came in a bit before the US because the current US administration is so slow on these matters. So what I would expect with the Biden administration, that is, as Mike emphasized, that there will be coordination with the European Union, presumably also with the UK and with Canada, and that this line would be much closer to the Baltic line than what we are seeing now. So this situation in Europe showed how much Europe still needs US leadership in order to get the security questions right. And what should be done? Franak and Tsikhanouskaya strongly argued that one should sanction hundreds of the people. I think that that principle is right, because this is a question of changing the incentives for individuals who are now participating in repression. It's nothing that they have to do. It's their choice to obey unlawful orders. So this is the Nuremberg principle, that you punish people if they have done things that they shouldn't do, even if they have been ordered to do so. The US has been much more focused on taking a limited number higher up. We have seen that, for example, in the Donbass sanction, that the EU has sanctioned many more, but lower down. And I think that Franak is right on this point, that one should sanction many. Then we're coming to the spurious question about financial sanctions or other economic sanctions. I'm very skeptical of any trade sanctions, because that would just make Belarus more dependent on Russia. Today, more than half of the Belarusian trade is with Russia. And also most of the exports to the West is fertilizers and petrol, which is refined Russian crude. So you don't want to push Belarus further into the arms of Russia. So if there should be any financial and economic sanctions, I would rather put it on the Russian companies and oligarchs that are behind what is happening in Belarus. There are, for example, a few oligarchs that are now intent on taking over the two big refineries and the two big fertilizer companies in Belarus. These people should be scared off with contingency sanctions against them, if that is a threat against them, if they do take over these companies. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anders. One more question for you, and then we're going to get to the blitz. We're going to do 20 questions in 20 minutes or less. Anders, what about disconnecting Belarus from the SWIFT system? Is that a good idea, or is that irresponsible?
It's a bad idea for many reasons. First, the European Union will be strongly against it. SWIFT is a private organization. It's based in Belgium, and the US does not control it in any relevant way. Iran has been taken off from the SWIFT, but this is the nuclear option. This is what you do in the last turn. Before that, you undertake one financial sanction after the other. And there is a certain logic of escalation that you don't throw out the kitchen sink instantly.
Okay, fair enough. Now we have 20 minutes. I have a number of questions. If you haven't had a chance yet, go ahead and open up the Q&A box. Type a question. Gentlemen, you have about a minute when I fire these at you, so get ready to be succinct. The first one's for Mike Carpenter from Ambassador William Courtney. Agree with Mike, there will be more coordination with Western Europe, but will Biden likely lead from behind Western Europe since the US has few ties to Belarus, or might Biden take the lead for the West?
Well, I think we have to push the envelope as much as we can. I agree very much with Anders. I think that doing something like SWIFT sanctions would only push the Belarusian economy into the abyss, and essentially give Russia the option of swallowing up Belarus and claiming that it's doing that in order to protect Belarusian workers and ordinary citizens from economic catastrophe. So I favor working with the EU to put in place a substantial number of sanctions on agents of repression, on crony companies tied to Lukashenka, and then really working on the assistance piece where we both have tools. I don't think that the US has no stake in Belarus, as perhaps is implied by Bill in the question. I think we have plenty of stake. I think we have to contest Russian influence and also push back for the sake of democratic norms. And we can do that together with the EU in tandem, as I said earlier.
Wonderful. Ambassador Herbst from James Shoemaker. He says, I understand that FSO Julie Fisher has been nominated by the Trump administration for Belarus and is currently awaiting confirmation. Has there been any change in this situation?
As the short answer is no. There's still negotiations, I understand, going on between the administration and the Hill, but I think there will be a resolution soon, although we're not certain about this. And I think Franak laid out the concerns that we should have an ambassador nominated and confirmed, but not present credentials to Lukashenko. And I suspect that's going to be what happens.
Wonderful. Thank you. Franak, how do local journalists and bloggers contribute to the mobilization of women in the protests? And more specifically, how does Instagram, an image-based social media platform, support the narrative of the opposition in Belarus? This is from Jessica Meyerson.
Instagram and Telegram are major platforms for communication right now. Telegram is more for breaking news and for citizen journalism. During the 4 months of protest, people were sending and sharing their videos, photos taken on the streets. You know that the foreign reporters were expelled from Belarus. Many journalists are in jail and face multi-year prison terms. So people became journalists themselves, and they publish videos, pictures on Instagram primarily, but also to share news on Telegram. And I think this is the purest social media revolution we ever seen.
Another question for you, Franak, while I have you. This is from Vlad Davidson, who's been writing for us wonderful dispatches for Belarus Alert. He says, can the diaspora of Belarus be more involved in solidarity actions as the substantial Moldovan and Ukrainian diaspora have been? Do you see any opportunity for that?
This revolution united Belarus diaspora. It's one perhaps of the most organized diasporas in the world right now. I think there are more than 55 countries with organized groups of Belarus diaspora. They are lobbying for political support, for financial support. They organize events. They organized more than 500 rallies during last 4 months. It also exists in the United States, and during last months, in every state of the United States, they sent a letter to local senators to support the Belarus Democracy Act.
Thanks so much. David Kramer says, Julie Fisher should land in Vilnius first and present her credentials to Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, then go to Minsk. It obviates the awkward photo op of presenting to Lukashenka or the Belarus Foreign Ministry. Lukashenka might kick her out or even deny her entry, but then that could take on a dynamic in its own right. Any comment to that, guys? Or thumbs up along the way? Ambassador Herbst wants to jump in. Go ahead, John.
David is always trenchant and on point. The key is that she be confirmed, that she go to Vilnius and interact with the opposition. Going to Minsk, I think that's probably going to be a decision for the new administration.
Okay, another one for you, John. This is from Voice of America. What leverage can the Biden administration have to try to change Moscow's calculations regarding Belarus?
I have been a big fan, without success so far, an advocate of setting down some what I call conditional sanctions. Sanctions that would apply to Moscow would be passed in advance or announced in advance of what would happen, for example, if they wind up sending security forces into Belarus or troops into Belarus to crack down on the opposition and to prop up Lukashenko. I think that would deter, not necessarily prevent, but deter Moscow from intervening in a more serious and nasty fashion.
Wonderful. Thank you. Anders from Gunther Fillinger, he wants to know how much is Russia investing in Belarus since August, and how long can and will Russia sustain such levels of subsidies?
Very little is the short answer. Putin promised Lukashenko $1.5 billion in credits, $1 billion from Russia itself and $500 million from the emergency fund of the Eurasian Economic Union, which Russia controls, but it's not Russia's. And then what Putin foresees is that Russian private companies will buy Belarusian companies cheaply. He emphasized that there are 2,500 Belarusian companies with Russian capital. Many Russian small enterprises have actually moved to Belarus because the enterprise environment is better in Belarus. The risk of corporate raiding, that is that somebody steals your company, is much less in Belarus than in Russia, according to Russian businessmen. So this is what I really worry about, because we saw a similar thing in Armenia. First, there is a debt equity swap, so that a company with a state company with big debt is being exchanged for shares, and then this is only a fraction of the actual cost of the company. So I think that this is a real danger, and this is something that I think the West should pay a lot of attention to. And I suggest the kind of sanctions that John just suggested, warn the Russians, if you do this, we will hit you with very severe sanctions. And I should emphasize here that I think that we can hit Russia much more with financial sanctions. I think that Russia is much more vulnerable than we think. After all, this is a country that has had no economic growth at all since 2014. That is when the Western sanctions started, and admittedly the oil price also fell at the same time. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Anders. Mike, you get a good one. This is from Natalia Otel Balan. She says, do you think Belarus may turn into Venezuela, where the dictator will not leave and the country continues to fall apart? What can be a breaking point for the Lukashenko regime? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I'm not sure that the parallel is apt. I think most likely Maduro has slightly wider basis of support within Venezuelan society, even as he continues to loot the country and repress all those elements that are antithetical to him. I think in Belarus, really at this point, as I said earlier, it's just the Siloviki that are with him, even within government institutions, even in fact, as the next leaks have shown within his own presidential administration, there are senior people who are not happy with the situation, who don't think he's playing things well. He's slightly changed his tune, for example, on COVID, but there's a lot of people in institutions of power who see Lukashenko's pronouncements or failure to act on COVID and say, what the heck is this guy doing? So, I think the bottom line is that there's just that sort of Ministry of Interior and KGB phalanx around him, and not much more beyond that. I don't know Venezuela as well, so it may be that it's also a narrow group of repressive organs around Maduro. But I see, over time that group will probably begin to have attrition, and there will be defections, and hopefully, that'll happen soon, and it can result in a real change. But when it exactly happens, it's just very, very hard to predict.
Great, thank you. Franak, I've got about 3 for you. This one is from Matthew Murray. He says, have you seen any evidence that the migration of Belarusian ICT businesses to neighboring countries is placing real economic pressure on Lukashenko?
I think it will have long-term consequences, economic consequences for Belarus, and we will have big trouble to get this company back to Belarus after Lukashenko. Because right now, yes, they built infrastructure in Ukraine, in Poland, in Lithuania, Latvia, and these countries are happy to embrace them, of course, but we should think already now how to get them back. Economically, of course, it's a huge hit on Lukashenko, but I think he will suffer much more from these fertilizers and then the petrol products limitations. And already now, without sanctions, fertilizers export and then income decreased by 20% without sanctions again.
Wonderful. Okay, next question for you is from Grace Cure. And she says, please discuss the role and impact of women and women's involvement in the achievements of the opposition movement, especially on the ground.
Critical. women actually made this revolution, and I'm just impressed, amazed, inspired by women leaders, by Maria Kolesnikova, Veronika Tsapkala, and of course Sviatlana Tsikhanouskaya, Nina Baginskaya. Many women are in jail right now. Many women are recognized as political prisoners. Many women sportswomen, sports athletes are in jail and several face multi-year prison term. They serve as inspiration. They lead this revolution. Their protest every week inspired many to join. And thanks to this uprising, we can really speak about equality that was formed on the street. And I think in the future, Belarus, there will not be a place anymore for gender discrimination.
Let's hope so. Let's hope so. Franak, question for you. When and how do you want to change the Constitution? And would you consider involving the Venice Commission in these kinds of changes?
We sent to Venice Commission several articles from the current administrative and criminal codes of Belarus used against protesters, just to get their explanation, their comment on these articles, because we think that they are misused by so-called courts in Belarus. But changes of constitution in general, I think this is a bit manipulative topic right now. What we have to do, we have to get back to the constitution before Lukashenko 1994 and make amendments after on it, because major principles of division of power are in the constitution before Lukashenko. There is no need to transform Lukashenko's constitution, which is already destroyed by him during 3 referendums.
Got it. Thank you. A question from Carl Alto. He says, hi, all. Please say something about views in Belarus now towards Western institutions, towards the EU, towards NATO, and views toward Russia. I know there's a new poll about that, Franak. Could you take that question as well?
There is increase in favorability of European integration among Belarusians, and there is 11 points decrease of pro-Russian integration. But in general, Belarusians are very Belarusian thinking is very dichotomical. They can be both pro-Russian and pro-Western. They can be both pro-integration with Russia and integration with the European Union, and even with flags. They can be both pro-white, red, white, and pro-red, green. So they don't want really to choose between. They want to be friends with everyone. So we are trying, to keep this consensus actual. We are trying to repeat that we don't have enemies, just friends. There is disappointment in European Union because expectations were high. And there is disappointment that the European Union supported and collaborated with Lukashenko for so many years. But there is a huge disappointment, much bigger, with Russia, which position cannot be explained logically for Belarusians fighting and the suffering.
And what do you attribute it to, Franak?
You mean numbers or what?
Yeah, why do you see the decline? It's declined at least 10%.
11 points decrease by Belarusian Analytical Workshop, its organization which conducted survey last month. So there is a decline during last 2 months. And this decline will continue, because this Russian media attacking Tsikhanouskaya every day, and people who are liking, and favorizing Tsikhanouskaya, it goes against their personal feelings, and they are disappointed both with media and official Russian position.
Thanks. Question for Ambassador Herbst and for Dr. Carpenter. And this is from Paul Carter. He says, what about an Armenian scenario in Belarus? The Kremlin takes advantage of Tikhanovskaya's statements that the democratic movement is not anti-Russian, allows Lukashenko to fall, then works in a year or two to undermine the new government.
Michael?
John, go ahead.
Okay. Look, I don't rule this out, but I would not count on this having great chances of success. As Franak just pointed out, the constant attacks on her have diminished, and support for Lukashenko have diminished Russia's popularity in Belarus. And they are riding a tiger, and it's not clear how they get off.
Okay, great. Mike?
Well, so I would say, if in fact Putin decides to allow Tsikhanouskaya to come to power, that would be a marvelous thing. That would be a first-class problem to have. And, I think then the Western community of nations would really have to pour in support, both economic and technical, to allow her government to really have some backing behind it. And that would be fantastic. I don't think it's going to happen because I think that Putin understands that any space for independent political thought, for independent civil society, is a threat to sort of the kleptocratic authoritarian model that he champions. And so I see it as unlikely, but we shouldn't exclude it. And if it does arise, we should pounce on it.
Wonderful. Thank you. Franak, this one is for you from Ambassador Michael McFall. He said, what role is Voice of America and RFERL playing in Belarus now? What more could be done by the USG to facilitate the flow of news and information inside Belarus?
Unfortunately, Voice of America does not broadcast in Belarusian language and for Belarusians, and that's a huge mistake. We were asking for this for many, many years, and I think it's a good time to think to get back to this topic. I think with the new administration and USAGM management, it should be the issue number one. VOA is much more than just outlet or broadcaster. And Radio Free Europe, people are in jail. Ihor Losik was among the first people who were jailed, and he's facing multi-year prison term. He's a good friend of mine. Several journalists of Radio Free Europe who got released a few days ago. They spent weeks in prison, and they work without accreditation. They can be imprisoned any day. And they do tremendous work. Their reports, their videos, their photos reach millions, and literally, I do not lie, they reach millions of people every day. Radio Free Europe YouTube channel is number 2 in Belarus internet for the last 2 months.
Wonderful, thank you. Franak, I'd like to ask you one last question. A lot of people here want to help individual people. But many of the names are not known of the political prisoners and the journalists who are in jail. Those are all new names to us. Is there anything that ordinary people can do beyond just calling their congressman in trying to support some of the legislation?
Basic things, speaking about political prisoners, writing them letters, lobbying for Belarus topics, asking local journalists to write about Belarus. Everything is important. Personally, when I was in jail, when I was in prison or in the army, these letters from outside, it was my only support. And just find the person whose story you like and who is behind bars right now, and try to establish personal contacts with them. Yes, they receive letters. They can reply. Just leave your address to get answer. And I think this is the easiest everyone can do. And parliamentarians, congressmen, politicians can do something like mentorship, can take some political prisoner under, or how to say, take care, take responsibility, and do some political actions in support of these people and telling their stories again.
Wonderful, thank you. Those are great ideas. If you can put an address on your Twitter feed to help people know where to write letters. I know that people, including my 6-year-old daughter, want to start sending some letters to people in prison, especially during the holidays. Thank you so much, Franak. This was really illuminating. Thank you, Ambassador Herbst. Thank you, Dr. Oslin. Thank you, Dr. Carpenter. If you aren't receiving the weekly Belarus alert from the Atlantic Council, shame on you. Please get on our website, sign up. We would love to have you on our list. We can't wait to see you next time. We will continue to follow Belarus carefully. Until next time, thank you and have a nice day. Bye-bye.